Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton. Pleased to announce that we have a debate today between Eric Ibarra and Craig Trulia. Craig is an Eastern Orthodox and Eric Ibarra is a Roman Catholic. And the debate thesis is who started the schism between East and West. So we're going to be discussing basically, who was the primary group to initiate the schism, if there in fact really was one, between the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. So, Craig, Eric, how are y'all both doing?
Very good.
Doing well. How are you?
Yeah, doing good. I've been very excited about this. As I told y'all, I think in your first debate, I don't really watch sports or football or anything, so debating is just kind of my Super Bowl. So I've been waiting for this one with bated breath. So I'm definitely excited about it. All right, so let's discuss the rules of the debate. So, or at least the parameters. What we're going to do is have opening statements, each 10 minutes. Craig, you're going to go first, then Eric. Then we're going to have two rebuttals. Craig, you'll go first, then Eric, 7 minutes each. Then we will have 3 sets of cross-examinations, Craig, then Eric for each one. And each cross-examination will be 6 minutes. So after that, we will have our closing statements. Craig, you'll go first, then Eric, and they will be 10 minutes apiece. That totals to about 76 minutes. And after that, if we have any chat questions that you just put in the YouTube live chat, I'll ask them at the time, and I'll probably have a couple questions for both of you as well that I'll ask before the chat questions. So if y'all are ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
Let's do it.
Sure.
All right, so Craig, you have 10 minutes for your opening statement on who started the schism between East and West, starting now.
Well, it's great to be here tonight to present this case. Like I said in the first debate, it's an honor for me, a new convert, to remember being a Protestant, nipping at Eric's heels and bothering him, and then to be now presenting the case for a church that not long ago I thought was apostate. So with all humility, I'd like to say I'm just grateful to have this opportunity, and by God's grace, may we learn a lot tonight. I'd really look forward to learning a lot about the Roman Catholic perspective from Eric, and I hope this is something that's edifying to our whole audience. Now, for me, the reason this debate's important is because, speaking as an Orthodox Christian, Orthodoxy is seemingly superior in so many ways. Our liturgical life, our prayers, our overall affect is thoroughly Jewish, it's biblical, it's patristic. It just feels like the true church and what it would feel like after 20 centuries with just normal cultural differences and advancements. But feelings may be deceiving. So this is why I believe the issue of schism is so important. The scriptures, the fathers, history bear out the Orthodox Church, in my view, is one holy Catholic apostolic church, unbroken succession, and preserved from schism. So my hope is that the viewers, impressed by the merits of Orthodoxy's pedigree, will feel free, according to their own conscience, to attain salvation the way God intends for us, through Christ in the church, according to unchanging spiritual principles. So let me start with the scriptures, and then I'll get into the fathers. Now, the scriptures, essentially to summarize them, and there's not a lot in the scriptures about schism specifically, is schism is forcing someone out of the church. So let's say in John 16:2, Jesus Christ says, they will cast you out of the synagogues. And we'll get into St. John Chrysostom on that issue. But the idea is the Christians were not the ones who left. They're not the schismatics, right? So even when they're a part of Judaism, Christ is saying they're going to do this because they are the schismatics. Perhaps the only letter that really gets into this issue in any profound way would be 3 John, everyone's favorite letter in Scripture. And in verses 9 and 10, it says, Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, John writes, I'll call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. All right, so we can see in both examples, putting someone out is schismatic. It's really not a very complicated issue. The issue is more nuanced in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We can maybe get into that in these 1,000 cross-examinations we have, but I'll leave that there for now. Let me get into the fathers in schism. The fathers have a little bit of a more specific definition. To summarize it, is schism is forcing someone out of the church and setting up a parallel church in doing so. So, for example, not recognizing the bishop that God has ordained and then installing another in his place. This, in my view, contradicts the Roman Catholic definition in 2089 of their catechism, which states, schism is the refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. All right. Now, the reason I think this is important is because we're going to see the biblical and patristic view, which I'm laying out, really is not the view of the Roman Church today. In fact, I can't think of anyone that gave the views in the way in which we just read in the Catechism, but hopefully maybe Eric could make that case. Now, I kind of indiscriminately went through my commentaries behind my back, Aquinas Study Bible, New Advent, to go, okay, what did the fathers just say about the word schism if you look at it? Now, let's look at the first treatise by St. Cyprian, paragraph 12. He writes, for we have not withdrawn from them, but they, speaking the Novatians, from us, since heresies and schisms have subsequently, from their establishment for themselves of diverse places of worship, they have forsaken the head and source of the truth. So as we see, the whole definition I laid out is pretty much right there from Cyprian. To continue, let's go to St. Optitus, who's speaking against the Donatist heresy, and against the Donatist, book 1, chapter 10. He writes, for it was not Caecilian who went forth from Majorinus, your father's father, but it was Majorinus who deserted Caecilian, nor was it Caecilian who separated himself from the chair of Peter or from the chair of Cyprian, but Majorinus, on whose chair you sit, a chair which had no existence before Majorinus himself. So we see again, the accusation is they separated from us, right? You started it, not us. As childish as that sounds, but this is the argument. You started it, not us. And you set another chair. It's not the chair of Peter, which he conflates with the chair of Cyprian. All right. And this is important because it comes up again in his writing. St. Optitus writes, and against the Donatists, book 2, chapter 2. So we have proved that the Catholic Church is a church which is spread throughout the world. You cannot then deny that you do not know that upon Peter, first in the city of Rome, was bestowed the episcopal chair of which sat Peter, the head of all the apostles, for which reason it was called Kephas, that in this one chair, unity should be preserved by all, lest the other apostles might claim, each for himself, separate chairs. Right? So one chair. This is center to Optitus' thoughts. Every bishop is in the chair of Peter. So that he would set up a second chair against the unique chair would already be a schismatic and a sinner. Well, then, on one chair, which is first of the endowments, Peter was the first to sit. So again, whether it's Cyprian's chair, St. Firmilian, whether it's whoever's in Jerusalem, Antioch, doesn't matter. They all sit in the chair of Peter. This is central to the theology of the early church. This is why if we read in Eusebius and Irenaeus, all these apostolic succession lists, whenever they're giving succession of a church that's not Rome, it always starts not with Peter or with even apostle. It starts with either the lesser apostle or the first bishop. The idea being that Peter, if you really think of, let's say, even the churches Paul started, how did Paul become a bishop? All right, well, Paul was either ordained in Antioch, we see in Acts chapter 13, or when he was given the right hand of fellowship, he was ordained by Peter. So even the Pauline churches would have had Petrine succession. In fact, you think of almost any church in the ancient world, they would have been connected to Peter in some way. I mean, obviously, Peter was the primary bishop in Jerusalem before he left and James took over. So again, this is central to the theology and it's intrinsic in the writing of the fathers. For example, St. Jerome in Against Jovinian, book 1, paragraph 26, he says, the church is founded upon Peter, although in another place the same thing is done upon all the apostles, and they all received the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And the strength of the church is established equally upon them all. Yet therefore, among the 12 apostles, one is chosen, that being a head appointed, so the occasion of schism may be taken away. So again, this is not like some sort of crazy way for the Orthodox Church to kind of recast, what it means to be in the seat of Peter and take that away from the Church of Rome. This is something that's in Western and Eastern Fathers' writings. You can see it in the succession list. This is something that's very important because it shows that all bishops sit in the seat of Peter. So any argument that's going to say that if you're out of communion with the seat of Peter, you're not in the church, you're in schism, is really incorrect. It's misunderstanding what it means to be in the seat of Peter. Now, I don't have a ton of time, so I want to cover a couple more fathers, and we'll probably leave cross-examination to get into, okay, knowing this, how does it show that Rome started it? All right, St. John Chrysostom writes in his commentary, Matthew 15:34, he, that is Jesus Christ, is moreover continually frequenting the synagogues, lest if you're always abiding in the wilderness, they should the more accuse him as making a schism and fighting against their polity. Right? How important it was that to the fathers that it was the Jews that broke off the church, not the other way around. Augustine in letter 87, paragraphs 1-2, Augustine writes, "Why then have you severed yourselves by so rash and profane a schism from the communion of innumerable Eastern churches? It is manifest that you have been guilty of impious schism in separating yourselves from the communion of the whole world," right? Not communion from Rome. And Augustine's a Western father. It's communion from the whole world because it's understood that all these bishops would have sat on the seat of Peter. This is central to Cyprian's theology, which we read in his on the unity of the Catholic Church. Saint Beatus of Ljubljana in Spain, 8th century, wrote, "Those who try to make heresies and schisms now in the church and deceive many who are drawn along with them, looking down on the priests of Christ and separating many from fellowship with their clergy, they dare to set up churches, and some make prayers at another altar with illicit voices, profaning the truth of the Lord's Day, victim by false sacrifice." So again, the idea is setting up a parallel church. You split off and you appoint new bishops. So this is, let's consider what the scriptures and fathers said and how they relate to this topic, right? By the Roman criteria, the East is in schism the moment they were excommunicated by the Pope. But that's not what we just read in the scriptures and the fathers, right? By the biblical and patristic definition, Rome was in schism when in a complete breakdown of basic Christian charity, they did several things, and we're not going to have time to go through all of them right now. But obviously before 1054, they appointed new bishops in Italy after Norman conquest without the consent of local populations who for centuries resisted Roman encroachments. In 1054, again, scholars are aware that the East never excommunicated the West. We know this from a letter of Basil Calabria, that, for example, Rome was well aware that they said, you must submit to papal jurisdiction or we're going to let the Normans replace their bishops. While on the other hand, the letter of Emperor Alexios shows that they never considered the West excommunicated. And I'm waiting for you, Mike, to tell me 30 seconds.
That's 10 minutes there. I'm sorry. I'll give you a 30-second warning next time. Apologize.
So I'll say this 30 seconds. We're going to go through examples in this debate of the Crusades, not only in the Middle East, but also in Europe. The policy of the Unions. Rome, over centuries, followed a schismatic approach due to a deficient ecclesiology, which is not patristic, not biblical. And that's why, in all charity, I cannot say that anyone other than the Orthodox Church is the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Everyone else has went into schism, sadly.
All right. Eric, you now have 10 minutes for your opening statement, beginning now.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So, in a nutshell, I am a Roman Catholic, so I will be defending the position that Rome is not in schism. However, if I was to answer this question, who started the schism under a professor, I'd have to go through a lot more nuance than I would be in this presentation, because I think both sides are to blame in many ways, and that goes even for the legitimate side who is not in schism. We see, when we talk about East and West schism, a lot of people think of the first millennium as the church of the undivided body of Christ. But that's not really true. We had the Nestorian schism in the 5th century, which became the Assyrian Church of the East, which today has come back into union with Rome in the majority case. There's still many who are not. There in the 5th century, again, there's a monophysite schism. That's the schism that followed the Council of Chalcedon. And then there were the monothelites in the 7th century. It's another schismatic society that pretty much branched off and grew from the monophysite sect. And then there was the iconoclastic episcopate in the East, which constituted another schism. And there were other schisms over non-doctrinal matters as well throughout the first 1,000 years, but those were the major the schisms in the first millennium. Then you have the Greek Byzantine schism, and that's the one we're talking about today. When did this start? There's really no one date. It's really hard to say that there's one date. We have several landmarks throughout history, and certainly the biggest would be, I believe, the situation of Photius of Constantinople. That was a major, major landmark, which did not end in a schism between East and West, ironically. But there was an anchor dropped in the ocean on certain subjects, which did not get fully resolved then, which would be the material that stops the boat later. Another big landmark would be the schism, which took place in Constantinople when Pope Leo IX's legates came to Constantinople and met up with the patriarch there, Michael Carolarius. This whole fiasco began with certain pride on both sides, you could say. Michael Carolarius was a man who was eager for liturgical uniformity, but then again, that was also encroaching in the West as well, particularly in Rome. And Cardinal Humbert had a hand in writing against certain Greek liturgical usages, even in Rome, in Italy. But in any case, there was a formal excommunication between Michael Carolarius and the legates of the Pope at the time. I think all of our viewers would know that this was not a formal excommunication of Rome or a formal excommunication of Constantinople. This was another landmark. It did not end in a formal universal break between East and West. But again, the subjects there that were talked about became the material that would later on form the doctrinal, liturgical, cultural, and disciplinary reasons for the schism that eventually broke us completely in half. I agree with Craig that the best place to put the schism, which really breaks it, is during the Crusades, the sack of Constantinople, where we see obviously, but the Pope did not order the sack of Constantinople. Our viewers need to know that. There was animosity on both sides, largely due to issues outside of the ecclesial realm. Of course, there was the slaughter of the Latins in 1182, which is 20-something years before the sack of Constantinople. That's where, under one of the Comnenus emperor, Byzantine emperor, there was 60,000 Latins approximately, that's what I read in the history books, that were slaughtered in Constantinople. And political, there were religious reasons behind it that sent a sword piercing through the heart of the Latin West, obviously. It was a small part in the sack, which would take place in 1204 in terms of cause. But following that sack, there was the planting of Latin bishops, particularly in the bishopric of Jerusalem and Constantinople, which not all the Greeks recognized. There were some Greeks who did, though. So it wasn't as if this was some, universally, understood violation. There were Greeks, and there were Greeks who recognized these bishoprics. Didn't last long. Lasted about 60 years almost, when the Byzantine armies took back Constantinople and were able to establish Greek bishops back in their sees. It was at this time really that the East and West really did not see each other they didn't see each other as in communion, not just on a doctrinal level, but at the heart of the lay person. This is where we see it right here after the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople, and the competing hierarchies in the East. Of course, we have the reunion attempts at the Council of Lyons in 1274 and Florence. And at both of these councils, there's two things to know. What was asked of the Greeks is nothing less substantially than what was asked and received in the first millennium, namely that the Roman See has a certain essential, divinely instituted role and function in the government of the church, the organization and unity of the church, and that there's a certain charism and authority invested in that because of certain prerogatives given to the Apostle Peter by Jesus Christ. In both of those councils, Lyon 1274 and Florence 1439, the famous formula of Hormisdas from the schism that took place between East and West in 518. The formula of Hormisdas was signed once again. It had been signed many times before. It was signed by the Greeks at the Council of Lyons and at the Council of Florence. And this was a time where we could put aside a lot of the grievances between East and West and look at the doctrinal matters, that material, again, that I said. During the schism, which took place during Photius' life, there was unmistakable claims of papal supremacy by the popes, Pope St. Nicholas, and after him, Pope John VIII. In both cases, they made unmistakable claims of papal supremacy on divine law, and this was never picked out as a reason, kind of like Nestorius' error or Eutychus' error or Sergius and Pyrrhus and Honorius' error or the error of the iconoclasts. Papal supremacy was not picked out as a reason to accuse the Latins of heresy, at least formally. I'm sure there was some bickering. There were certainly some private letters and certain public ones that may have indicated that. But the Eastern bishops, when they assembled with Roman representation, they tolerated it at the very least. And many of them depended on it.
30 seconds.
Okay. So Greek Catholicism did eject something of its teaching when it left Western communion, papal communion, and that was acceptance of the papacy. In short, that's what it boils down to. And because of that, any reunion effort would be on the side of the Greeks reacquiring that belief that they had with the West in the first millennium.
All right, Craig, so now you're going to respond with your rebuttal, and you have 7 minutes beginning now.
All right. I have to say, I get so excited teaching this subject. I sound like this raving lunatic. Eric is like measured and calm. And the funny thing is I argue with people all day for a living, and I'm the measured and calm one. But I guess I'm just not quite as passionate about those subjects. That being said, in my response to Eric, he mentions first millennium. There's several schism historians, Miaphysites, and we could discuss this issue. But I'd say in all those cases, it's very clear that they are the schismatics. They did not submit to an ecclesiology they accepted. They went back and forth, and then just usually killing people and stuff. They went their own way. And so I think we could discard with them very quickly. And I think actually for us, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, we would have to presume upon it. Otherwise, the Oriental Orthodox are the ones that are in the schism or something to that effect. I like Eric mentioned about an anchor being dropped about the filioque. I'll have to concede in this argument this much. I don't understand the filioque issue theologically. So if any questions are pressed on that, I'll be limited in my responses. So there you go. End of debate, telling you one of my weak spots. But it's something that is true and something, sadly, I can't flesh out more. Maybe, hopefully, Eric could bring that out a little bit because it is an important topic. One I'll be neglecting, sadly. He talks about no formal or universal break in 1054, but which is true in some respect because we, as far as I know, don't have a pope signing, yes, they are excommunicated. But we do have popes, like I said, saying, okay, we will replace your bishops unless you submit to me. We'll let the Normans do that. If you submit to me, then we will. I'll talk to the Normans pretty much and have them not do that. So again, when you look at, okay, what schism biblically, traditionally, to me that already is a schism. Even there's no formal declaration, I excommunicate you or something like that. Because by all facts, that was like already they were trying to Latinize Eastern practices, not accept their Eucharist, things of that effect. But again, that's also a more nuanced issue, which gets into sacramental theology. So I'll table that for now. Eric admits that the Crusades really are the cause of schism. If you want a short answer, what started the schism? The answer is the Crusades. I agree 100%. He mentions the Pope did not order the sack of Constantinople. That is true. In fact, I don't think he really actually wanted it. But that didn't stop him from, with his own hands, ordaining the bishop of the parallel church set up in Constantinople. So perhaps not the most willing participant in schism, yes, but he did initiate that schism in that situation by, again, ordaining the parallel church by the parallel bishop in that jurisdiction. This slaughter of the Latins, I think, is somewhat messy historiography, but that's true of all, archaeologists and historians that are trying to guess at demographics. 60,000 Latins being slaughtered. That's 1% of the Holocaust. That means, like, in one day, they did a better rate than the Nazis did the Jews over 4 years, and they had death camps and stuff. So I don't believe those numbers. The slaughter of the Latins was a race riot. It was not this profound a religious expression any more really than the conquering of Constantinople was. The point at issue is whether or not, one, were there indulgences given for killing these people and replacing their bishops? There was on the Western side. And two, did they put new bishops? Did they set up a second church? Did they meet the criteria of what the fathers said is this parallel church, this schismatic body? Clearly, the West would have in those situations. He makes note, Eric says that the Greeks would recognize some of the local bishoprics. And this, again, speaks to even today, different sacramentologies within the Orthodox communion. But the question would be where, right? Where's the Greeks that were pretty much under Latin domination, just like in southern Italy, that had no choice but to go to the Latin bishops so they could continue their practices. So again, that doesn't really speak to a tacit admission of Roman ecclesiology in this case, nor does it make what Rome did not schismatic. We speak of the reunion councils, and what I think comes up in Eric's response is this. He says, Rome makes claims of papal supremacy, and there is no objection, no formal objection. And essentially, I just say, no, that's just false. I mean, for one, we see even in the 16th century session of Chalcedon, they told the Roman legates to go home. They said, we have Canon 28, go home. If you don't like it, go home. We don't care. I mean, if it was really thought that, Leo the Great settled all matters, they would have never even held the council, like I said in the first debate. So that's something that's worth seeing. Another thing is we see Pope Agatha's letter, the Formula Homicidas, and all these other things, like kind of these bats to smack the Orthodox. But does anyone ever read what these same things were in Greek versus the Latin manuscripts? It seems to me quite obvious that in Rome, those in Rome knew what they were getting at, but when they actually translate in this Greek and get the Greeks to sign on, they were so different. They were not teaching Roman supremacy. And I'd more than happily go into the minutes of Constantinople III, Nicaea II. This is something that even Roman Catholic scholars are very well aware, and some of them even argue that's why the papacy has to be a doctrinal development, because it's clear the East never accepted this. And so the schism started, one, Rome forcefully starting this parallel church. Again, we're going to get into examples and cross-examination. And two, pretty much Rome trying to say, okay, now we can actually force our ecclesiology upon you, not just, hide it in manuscripts and translators and all this stuff. And we're going to force it by force. So there's no confusion about this. So that's why there were no formal condemnations of what was in Rome before. I think there was doubts they even really meant it. And I think there's good historical reasons for that. So I agree. There must be some acceptance of primacy of the papacy according to the fathers. This is a freaking orthodoxy now. And I'll just leave it there because it sounds like I'm out of time.
No, you got 22 more seconds. Go ahead.
All right. So that being said, Orthodoxy still has it now. I mean, the last few decades, until the whole thing in Ukraine happened, just the amount of power and jurisdictions taken over by the Bishop of Constantinople just shows that even within Orthodoxy, they understand primacy, how these things, following canon law and these things. And so if Rome were in communion, if they didn't go in schism, these things would still exist. So it's somewhat of overly simplistic to take the extreme Russian view and say that really doesn't exist in Orthodoxy. For all practical purposes, it does. If Rome were back in communion, until the canon laws change, Rome would then reacquire all these primacies.
Okay, Eric, now you have 7 minutes for your rebuttal beginning now.
Okay. What I would say is that it is true that there was a difference in many of the manuscripts, that the Latin and the Greek manuscripts that were translated at councils. The perfect example would be the Council of Nicaea II. The letters of Pope Hadrian the First translated in a different way in the Greek, kind of to tone down the papal supremacy. It's still there, but it's toned down. But you don't get that with the Council of Constantinople 879, though, which has almost untouched any modification of what Pope John VIII was basically claiming, which was that Christ invested supreme authority in the Apostle Peter, and that by succession from the chair of Peter, all the bishops of Rome have inherited that same authority over the universal church. And that the character of that is to be able to explore, investigate, and intervene into foreign affairs, and to make binding decisions. So that was there. I know that the Eastern Orthodox do not consider that an ecumenical council, but it is still a council which happened and occurred while they were in communion with one another. I would disagree with Craig's reading of some of the Byzantine texts on the papal supremacy, where they actually didn't mean it, or some of the for example, the Council of Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon, it's often said that they were somehow, didn't recognize the authority of Pope Leo. Well, I think a reading of the Acts would clearly demonstrate that most of the bishops were in agreement with the tome of Leo from the get-go. And there was a very small minority voice, mainly those who supported Dioscorus, who was the heretic who presided at the robber council of 449 in Ephesus. The rest of the bishops were pretty much pounding their fists on the table for the whole council to uphold the tome of St. Leo as a criteria of orthodoxy, alongside letters of Cyril, the Council of the Creed of Nicaea and the Creed of Nicaea I, and especially Cyril's letters. But the legates told the council at a certain session, I think it was the fifth session, where the bishops were in disagreement over adding a certain clause to the definition of faith that they were constructing. The papal legates protested and basically said, if this clause is not inserted in a certain way to teach the tome of what's in the tome of St. Leo, we'll pick up and go home. They did say that. And I don't recall any of the other bishops saying, fine, go home. What I recall is the imperial commissioners threatening the council that it would be moved over to Italy, where Pope Leo himself would preside. And that was the alternative. So the bishops, those who protested, acquiesced and said, fine. So, they held a committee and they came up with an agreed insertion, certain clause that would respect both Cyril and the tome of Leo. So in the end, legates won that, I would say. I mean, look, imperial. Sometimes when the emperor and his policy for the Roman Catholic is supportive of the Roman Church's policy, and since the Catholic Church teaches that Rome is the rock of the universal Church, it's invested with this supreme and legitimate authority over the whole Church, then the imperial policy would supersede any of the loose episcopal decisions that may have taken place elsewhere. We already know at the Council of Chalcedon that certain bishops had the policy that neither a council nor a pope nor an emperor could determine the truth, but that Scripture alone. That was the position of Eutychius. And that was the policy of many who had no problem going into schism after the Council of Chalcedon. Maximus the Confessor, Theodore the Studite of the Studite Monastery, Stephen of Dore, Sophronius of Jerusalem, Ignatius of Constantinople, Athanasius the Great, Saint Athanasius, Saint Flavian of Constantinople. These are all giants of the East who wrote unmistakably on the primacy and supremacy, and in some cases the infallibility of the Roman See. In cases where there's no real reason why it would be to their advantage to do so. Why would we resort to falsehoods in order to establish the truth? It's much more preferable to take them at their word, especially when the context simply gives that impression. So I think the onus is on the one saying that they didn't mean what they said, more so than the one who's citing them. So that's what I would say to that.
You got 30 seconds.
So the other thing I could say against that is the formula of Hormisdas was signed by the Greek episcopate in the 6th century. That was also not in a context where the East had something to gain from the West, through which they were willing to give into some cartoon language in order to make the Pope happy. It was a very difficult time, in fact.
You can wrap up your thought.
Yeah, it was very difficult, in fact. They suffered a lot of persecution, especially many of the monks, for coming into union with Rome. So yeah, the motives would have to be proven otherwise.
Okay. Craig, you're now going to cross-examine Eric for 6 minutes beginning now.
Alrighty. So let's see. When Eric, when Rome expelled the Orthodox Bishop of Antioch after 2 years of occupation of Antioch, because initially he stayed, it was part of the conditions of those in Antioch allowing in the Crusaders into the city. Was there any legitimate doctrinal reason for expelling him while he was still alive? No, there wasn't, and that's why I said there were many decisions that were made on the floor during the Crusades, during the takeover, that were lamentable, and they were criminal. All right. How about in Jerusalem? You know, again, the Bishop of Jerusalem at that time, because there was Jerusalem was they expelled him. He was in Cyprus, so he was in absentia. They put in another bishop there. Would you consider that schismatic?
Well, no, I wouldn't consider it schismatic, because it would only be an official schism if an appeal is lodged and there is no resolution to the problem. But per the jurisdiction teaching of Rome, when Rome installs a bishop in a foreign diocese, even when it is wrong, the churches, the bishops that are involved there, have no way of breaching that judgment until through prayer and patience, an appeal can be lodged and justice reached. But according to the claims made then, according to the claims made way before then as well in the first millennium, once Rome makes a decision, it can't be revoked because of the supremacy.
So just so I get this clear, only an official it's only official schism if an appeal was lodged. Who would they appeal to?
They would appeal back to Rome.
Okay, so Rome removes your bishop.
You would have a Greek.
Let me see if I get this right. So Rome removes your bishop. You appeal Rome, saying, "I don't like to remove my bishop." What happens next?
Well, he can respond saying, "Is there good reasons to retain that bishop?" The hope is that there's cordial relationship.
So presuming they had an impasse, there's no recourse in your mind beyond the Bishop of Rome.
Well, there could be. I would say at that especially at that point in time, the emperors could convene a council, obviously at the concession of the Pope, and further investigation into the issue could be had.
Okay, and so then at that point, the council would decide the matter, presuming, in your view, that the Pope ratified it.
Right. Yeah.
So there really is no recourse beyond the Pope. The Pope would have to agree every step of the way.
Well, the Pope has recourse to justice himself. And even though he's the final arbiter, he's under the law of God. He's not over the law of God. So the idea is when Christ gave over the church to the custodianship of the apostles, part of the risk involved there is that there are certain times where the people of God are going to be at the mercy of the pastor's ill decisions. And there's no recourse above that, but the pastors themselves are accountable to God. And we see this happen over and over again in the first millennium where there's bad pastors. What can the under clergy do about that? In many cases, there was nothing that they could do. We see this during
Is there, being that we know from St. Augustine that the idea was the Donzists could appeal to a council above the decision of the Pope, you're saying, well, the Pope would have to ratify it. I mean, I understand that's a rationale you give, but did any father or anything the scriptures explicitly say that was a contingent? If you appeal Rome, then you would be going to a council which is contingent upon Rome. Is there anything explicitly from history, or is this an inference you draw from different sources?
No, it's explicitly stated in history many times.
Which sources?
Well, the first would be Pope Innocent I.
So just what popes say.
What's that?
So just what popes say then.
Right, but you got to realize these popes in the first millennium that are venerated by the East, they're not representatives of the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church is a schismatic sect that was created, like you said, after the Crusades. So Innocent would be a voice of the Eastern Orthodox Church.
And so obviously we have, let's say, St. Hippolytus, and St. Cyprian died. Well, Hippolytus died in communion with Rome, but Cyprian didn't. Meletian, his whole life didn't. So how do we then understand people that lived their whole lives that are canonized saints, let's say like Meletius, outside the communion of Rome? Where was this kind of nod to Rome deciding whether or not he was really bishop?
Yeah, good question. So those are two isolated issues. I think you said Meletius, and who else was it?
Well, Cyprian died outside of communion.
Okay. Yeah, so let's take Meletius. I don't recall there's any evidence that he died outside of official excommunication from Rome. What I understand from that scenario is that there was a misunderstanding at first, which led into a big rivalry in Antioch over who was going to take the chair. And that rivalry was between Paulinus and Meletius. Rome and Alexandria supported Paulinus. Meletius never renounced communion with Rome. We know that from a letter from Jerome, at least, if we can trust in that. We can trust that there's no record saying that he went into schism from Rome. He presided at a council, or at least opened up the council of Constantinople 381, which the third canon speaks of Rome as first, Constantinople as two. It'd be awfully strange if he saw Rome as a schismatic sect and canonized its third canon, which assumes the primacy of that so-called schismatic church. So there was there was illegal situations in Antioch, but they were pending resolution, and they were resolved with the successor, Flavianus, who was accepted by Rome under the pontificate, I believe it was Syracuse or Anastasius. And Rome was appealed to by the emperor at the time, who the supporters of the rival of Paulinus were for. So Rome was consulted in that as well.
Okay,
and so it was brought to.
So would you disagree with scholars like Chadwick that say Meletius, his whole life, Chrysostom, most of his life, lived outside of communion with Rome? Do you feel that because they didn't respond to not accepting Rome, that shows that Rome never excommunicated them?
Well, from the available data that we have, I have not seen any direct evidence that there was a formal excommunication of Chrysostom by the Roman See. In fact, we see Chrysostom appealing to Pope Innocent. Of course, this was towards the end of his life. You're probably thinking of the first 17 years of his life. But yeah, I don't. Chadwick, I'd have to see the references and because from what I've read, I've never seen any evidence of any, again, formal excommunication of Meletius and Chrysostom. And you even had said at the beginning that the Orthodox Church is preserved from schism, but you also believe that Athanasius and Meletius are members of the same church, but at the time they were not in episcopal peace. So there's some level of nuance there when it comes to unresolved matters. And it's not like a light switch on and off. That's not how schism and excommunication work.
Let me jump in here. We ran out of the 6-minute mark, and I thought I had jumped in there.
10 minutes.
What happened was my microphone was muted, so when I jumped in to interject, y'all couldn't hear me. So what I'll do, Craig, what I'll do is give you an extra 3 minutes for your for this next portion, so you can take a little bit longer to respond to Eric when his 6 minutes is up. So in fact, actually, Eric, you would be getting some extra time to ask questions, and Craig extra time to respond for this part of the round. So go ahead and just take 9 minutes, Eric, to cross-examine Craig.
Okay.
Beginning.
Okay, Craig, you had mentioned that the episcopal office is really the chair of Peter. Would you say that chair of Peter was over the apostles?
Chair Peter over. I don't know about the word over, but it is apostolic in origin that the apostles' bishoprics were contingent upon Peter's himself. Okay,
so the relationship of the chair of Peter to the priests, deacons, and laity. So the chair of Majorinus, the chair of Cyprian. Did Cyprian have an authoritative relationship to his local diocese?
I presume so, yes.
Okay, so if Cyprian sits on the chair of Peter, and being on the chair of Peter means that he has an authoritative presidency, I'm assuming a binding episcopal authority over the Church of Carthage, wouldn't that mean that the chair of Peter has to have a territorial jurisdiction in order to match the parallel?
Well, that's one thing I don't see scripturally or patristically. It seems pretty clear that, let's say in Jerusalem, where Peter started as bishop before he moved on, that James had jurisdiction. We see some of this as frictions mentioned in Galatians. We see him chairing the council because it's in his jurisdiction. I wouldn't go as far to say that shows that he had some superior role in the church. I don't think the fathers taught that explicitly. So that being said, I think in Cyprian's mind, in which I would say would be consistent with what we see in the scriptures, that we see coming out the scriptures, would be that the local bishops in their areas had their own jurisdictions, and they would be responsible to whoever really was the archbishop, ultimately going back to the apostles who planted those churches. I think that's why, and I don't want to go too long a tangent, why even the churches in Greece until the 8th century were under direct Roman jurisdiction. There's no debate, like whether Rome is universal, this or that. I mean, like most of the Greek churches were under Roman jurisdiction because where did Paul die? He died in Paul. All the Pauline churches were under Roman jurisdiction until agreements were made and sometimes foisted upon Rome. We're going to talk about the 8th century where a lot of that changed. So I would still say local bishops have their own jurisdictions. Local metropolitans, etc., had their own jurisdictions where there really couldn't be interference. But there had to be, and I think there is soteriological parallels to this, there had to be a synergy between lesser bishops and superior bishops. All right? To have anything less is what I would like to coin ecclesiological predestinarianism. There is a synergy and a willing participation in the submission and in the ruling of both. We see this in Apostolic Canon 34. And so I see that consistent in early church and in the fathers. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question.
That's okay. But so you don't think that there's some sort of a relationship or a parallel giving the bishop's office the title chair of Peter if Peter himself didn't have a jurisdictional relationship to subjects under him? Because it would seem as though the chair of Peter itself has no significance in the answer you were giving.
It would, just like in Apostolic Canon 34, the metropolitan has significance, even though he can't do anything without the consent of the lesser bishops.
Right,
so
right.
Like
Cyprian in relation, sorry.
Yes.
But Cyprian.
So that's why the post-schism view in the Roman Catholic Church that, what the Roman Pope does is irreformable. He does not require consent. I mean, this is totally contradictory with basic ecclesiology in the early church, basic soteriology. I think there's obvious parallels, obviously, even within the triune Godhead. All these things are connected.
Okay, we'll move on from that. You mentioned Optatus of Miletus on the chair of Peter. Were you aware that of the endowments that he spoke about that were given to the church, one of them was the chair of Peter, and he certainly does say that this is pertaining to every bishopric. But then he says that it was installed in Rome, the one chair of Peter. So would you say he meant by that there is that universal significance of the Roman chair as the chair of Peter?
That's a great question. And there's some things that I've read entirely, and I could say I really understand the mind of Father in this work because I've read it a couple times in every sentence. With Optatus, I'm going more with what I found in selected readings. And so I would, lend the listeners here to look more thoroughly in the subject, and hopefully I'm pointing in the right direction by God's grace. And that would be my understanding of Optatus on this issue would be that he was particularly arguing against was there was this false succession of, essentially Donatist popes in Rome. What made it somewhat laughable is that these Donatist popes were kind of newcomers. They all knew when they started. They knew when the succession started. It clearly wasn't from the original chair of Peter, like small c, if we could talk about that. Just like small c, if we're going to talk about Cyprians in North Africa. So I think those comments, rightly understood, would be pertaining to how the local, local jurisdiction, local church in Rome, and this clear demonstration that Donatists is being schismatics, just appointing this guy that was never there, just like how Lucifer calls Gary, however you pronounce his name, put a bishop in Antioch that had no succession, and it's just clear to all who the usurper is. So I think that was more St. Optatus's point.
Okay. Of all the epistles of Augustine, there are a few, namely Answer to Papilian the Donatist, against the fundamental epistle of the Manichees, and a Psalmus contra Donati. In all of those, Augustine refers to the chair of Peter as the Roman episcopate, and it's very clear that he means that. What would you say of the statement? I'm going to read this for you here. He says, why a broken tree that is cut off from the vine retains its shape? But what use is the shape if it is not living from the root? Come, brother, if you wish to be engrafted into the vine of the church. It is grievous when we see you as a schismatic lying off, cut off. Number the bishops from the see of Peter, and in that order of fathers, see whom succeeds whom. This is the rock which the proud gates of Hades do not conquer. That's from Psalmus contra partem Donati. What do you think he means by that, associating the chair of Peter with the rock, and that obviously being from his other writings, the Roman bishopric?
Again, yes, some of those sources, like, against the Donatists, I've read, I think, 5 of those books. But some of the sources, I don't know everything or remember everything Augustine was saying. Here's what I think. I think it's still up to that point, there was a Donatist bishop in Rome. That could have been in mind. We also see, like what I quoted from Augustine in letter 87, he says, clearly, you're wrong because you're cut off from all these Eastern churches. I do not say that, right? I do not say that to pretty much make it look like that's their criteria, because we know that St. Optatus cites the same thing as well. It's more, it shows that both those fathers were picking clear examples that have been recognizable to all, that how schismatic-y the Donatists were. So I would read into those statements things pertaining to that. I would also want to add, if there was something more profound being implied about the chair of Peter, Augustine himself had some evolution in his thought about the significance of that by the end of his life, and we see that in his writing about the keys of Peter. So,
so we ran out of time. Let's go ahead and proceed with the next round of cross-examination. So, Craig, you're now going to cross-examine Eric for 6 minutes.
All right.
Go ahead.
So we're gonna go back to a topic I kind of bounced off of. So it looks like we're going backward, but we're just trying to go through all the material. And if it's an obvious answer, just, it is what it is. So, and that being said, we talked about Antioch, the replaced the bishop of Antioch. You said it's really not anything justified for any material reason. They just did it. Things like that have happened in history. How about my question to be in Jerusalem? Let's say like Leonidas of Jerusalem was, the Greek bishop of Jerusalem was forbidden to even enter, and he was given a death threat for trying to do a liturgy at, I believe, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Would you consider that, if we could use it as an adjective, schismatic-y, that they did not let this bishop of Jerusalem in? Or would you say, no, Rome was in the right to observe that they had a Latin bishop there, the Greek bishop had no right to be there?
Well, it was based on my understanding of the event, and I have not studied this with much depth, but that event was an act of injustice. It was an act of injustice. However, like I was saying before, the Lord, unfortunately, but in his wisdom, he sees it to our benefit, some weird reason. There are times where we will have to forbear with unjust decisions by evil shepherds, whether that's the Pope or certain bishops who represent the Pope in foreign lands. And recourse to schism, a reorganized episcopate, is not an option. And because the evil of schism is worse than all of that put together. So the impact of a schism would be far worse than forbearing with evil and dying in the peace of Christ's body. And this happens for both the Orthodox, the Catholics. It's happened all throughout Christian history. But like I said, there would be no recourse except to an appeal to justice, which is an appeal to the law of God, who is obviously the infinite superior of the Pope. So the hope would be to have faith that Christ will bring deliverance, even if that means through secondary causes, i.e., a Pope recanting an evil decision, or a Pope exposing the evil doing of those whom were representing him. In many cases, the hope is that the Pope can look at something, call an ecumenical council if need be, call a local council if need be. Witnesses are brought to the fore, and justice is served. Not every time is justice served. There's been many tribunals in Rome where justice was not served. But that does not entail that in each case of injustice that we have the green light to redraw a map on what the church is and who's in authority over the church. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so let's talk about, are you aware in the Aegean Islands, Cyprus, kind of like the later Crusades when they're withdrawing and conquering Greek islands along the way, so escaping the Turks, that intercommunion persisted, and that it persisted in areas where actually the local Greek jurisdiction was not expelled. Do you think there's any significance to that bearing on this conversation, and what would that significance be?
Well, I think the significance to that is that there were certain dire situations which required either two really tough decisions. One, you confiscate one bishop in favor of the other, or to tolerate two in one location. And, this is something that obviously Rome has semi-normalized with the Uniate organization that we have. It's something that the Orthodox have had to live with. It's not really their fault. It's more due to other providential circumstances where you have a bishopric, a multi-bishopric in one area. There were letters written to the Pope during the Crusades about this. And I forgot which Pope it was. I want to say it was Clement. Okay, I can't remember the number. And he lamented the decision, but he said that we would have to endure with a side-by-side bishopric until one of them would die, and then the other one would take over. This was sort of like what Melesius and Paulinus were supposed to do. So the significance to that would be simply that it's chess, not checkers.
All right, so that being said, and tell me, okay, here's my interpretation. Tell me if you think it's unfair and why.
Yeah.
My
15 seconds.
10 seconds?
15, but go ahead and just make it quick.
So question would be, it appears to me that when they allowed for the other jurisdiction to be there, all those conditions of creating a competing jurisdiction and the breakdown of Christian charity didn't occur, and that's why there was intercommunion. Would you agree with that analysis? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I need for you to unpack it a little bit more.
Okay.
You could do so, but make it really, really fast. And I'll just give a couple extra minutes.
I'll table it for now. We got 5 more cross-examinations.
Right. Okay, that's fine. So we'll just do it on the next round. Eric, so now you have 6 minutes to cross-examine Greg. Beginning now.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Again, we were talking about the chair of Peter. Jerome wrote a letter. It's number 15 in his collections. And this is during his stay in Antioch, when he was attempting to live out his monastic life there. He ran into, obviously, as you know, the Antiochian Schism. And he wrote to the Pope at the time, telling him about the situation. And he writes this. He says, "My words are spoken to the successor of the fisherman, to the disciple of the cross. I follow no leader save Christ, so I communicate with none but your blessedness, that is, with the chair of Peter. For this I know is the rock on which the church is built. This is the house where alone the lamb can be eaten rightly. This is the ark of Noah, and he who is not found in it shall perish when the flood prevails. But since by reason of my sins I have betaken myself to the desert, I cannot, owing to the great distance between us, always ask of your sanctity the holy thing of the Lord. Consequently, I here follow the Egyptian confessors who share your faith and anchor my frail craft under the shadow of their great argises. I know nothing of Vitalis. I reject Meletius. I have nothing to do with Paulinus. He that gathers not with you scatters. He that is not of Christ is of Antichrist." Close quote. What would you say Jerome is doing here by identifying the chair of Peter, which you rightly describe as the patristic item, principle of episcopal and ecclesial union? What is Jerome doing here associating the chair of Peter and its indispensableness to the borders of the true church with the bishopric of Pope Damasus? What's going on?
Now, I would agree with you when it comes to what it sounds like. It sounds like he's making a more overarching claim than what we could isolate from Augustine's writings or St. Titus or Cyprian, what we could gloss from the succession list and the argument pretty much I was making. I would agree with that. We have to pay attention also to the context that he's speaking the Meletian Schism. He's obviously taken the side of Lucifer Calciageri. Ironically, I think he eventually had a falling out with him, but that's kind of typical of Jerome throughout his life. And so that being said, it sounds to me like just like what Athanasius did in examples when they feel they have no one to appeal to in a situation, they exaggerate Roman pretensions. I don't think, and again, I'm not a Jerome expert, but unlike a Greek writer, I don't think Jerome himself was much of a given to hyperbole, at least not gross, inaccurate hyperbole, where you really can't get his point. I don't think when he wrote that was all too far off when he was in Rome, when he was literally rubbing shoulders with popes. And in my opinion, just as, for example, proof of Canon 3 of Constantinople I, we know for a fact that in the Latin canon, there was an interpolation that was read in Chalcedon that said, "Let Rome have the primacy," period, and then it goes into the rest of the canon, which was not in the legitimate canon. Scholars agree. So I would not disagree that the overarching Roman pretension definitely existed in Rome. It sounds to me, not knowing more about that letter, not knowing more about the circumstance Jerome was writing about, that Jerome was at that time in his life given to that idea. But there would have been a good reason for that, because how close he was, again, to the popes of his time. And that being said, he would have probably viewed himself as an extension of that party of people, especially during the Meletian Schism, especially with the idea that St. Meletius was a Arian, which he was not.
Okay, so would you concede then that Jerome, who again is a saint of the Orthodox Church, he's not a mouthpiece for Roman Catholicism, because Roman Catholicism is a post-Crusade sectarian creation?
30 seconds.
Would you say that that Jerome here, saint of the Orthodox Church, was misled in those thoughts?
I would say yes. Just like he was misled when he said that in Corinth they had multiple bishops, and he was quoting the schisms in Corinth of Apollos and Peter. So Jerome had speculations. This is something hopefully we'll have time to go over, is that the fathers do interpret things sometimes wrongly. But I think that'd be a detracting from, I think, your point, and I think what's historically relevant, which would be, this is a real idea in Rome. I do think, though, canonically, they did not view themselves above a council, which I think is the main differentiator. That's why we've said in our own correspondence, I believe that papal supremacy is a patristic doctrine within Rome, but about 90%. It's that additional 10% that makes the gross difference, which eventually became made union between both churches impossible.
Okay. Craig, you now have 6 minutes to cross-examine Eric. This will be the final cross-examination round, so you two can go at each other beginning now.
All right, so I'll have to go pretty quickly then. All right, so question for you would be, when Rome granted indulgences for crusades in the 13th century against historically Orthodox populations in Greece and Russia, and they were replacing bishops in those local communities, would you say such acts were schismatic?
Well, again, the original write-up of those indulgences was not specifically for the end of replacing bishoprics in the East.
But how about the policy taken as a whole, what do you say, that holistically?
Yeah, I mean, the Pope excommunicated many of the Crusaders for doing evil things. So many of them had to do penance and wrote back saying that they were wrong and they had to do penance. So
was it for replacing the local bishops, though?
The intention of those indulgences were to do something charitable to the Byzantine East, and for the Lord in particular, to regain the sanctified lands that were being invaded, and to secure peace for Christians. I agree with Steve Runciman that charity was at the foundation of the Crusades, but what was brought was a sword, not least into the heart of other Christians. It was tragic. But if we're going to talk about indulgences, we can't disassociate it from the intention of those indulgences, which was to do something on behalf of Christ.
So to put it more simply then, the policy of invading places of fellow Christians and replacing the bishops and killing them, that was not, in effect, schismatic.
The popes never gave indulgences for that, to my understanding.
They never gave indulgences for the Crusade.
But well, I can't ask any questions now. But it's not my understanding that we have a source that says, the Pope said, "Hey, if you go over there and start killing these people, so we have room for our bishops, we'll give you indulgences." All
right. So, and I'm sorry just to push forward because of time. Are you aware that Rome rejected multiple attempts at reunion that would have allowed for the Latin bishop serves up his term and then the Greek takes over? I mean, particularly I have one example in mind when Emperor John Vitesse made that offer about the Bishop of Antioch. Are you aware of that?
No.
All right. Let's talk about and I think this is a big issue. Are you aware of a single example of the Orthodox initiating the schism according to the biblical and patristic definition I gave?
Well, when the bishops in the East began to take the name of the Pope off of the name of celebrant, of the name of the diptych names, that would be when that happened on many occasions, and I would say when the East did that solidly, especially when there was a time, I think in 1024 was a big year, where the bishops of the East had written to the Pope at the time, and we have a Benedictine monk historian who writes about this. Constantinople was looking for Rome to put a stamp of approval on the title Universal Bishop, and Constantinople wanted Rome to concede that she was the supreme arbiter in the East. And Rome obviously rejected that. Nicetas of Nicaea, I believe his name was. I believe that's where he resided. He wrote about this and said that there was a schism under this pope in the East, and I think that would be one example among many, many more.
But how about, let's take examples. We're talking Crusades and afterwards. Do we have an example of the Eastern Church setting up a parallel church and replacing the bishops of Western jurisdictions?
Oh, no. I mean, we do not have that. All we have in the East are rejections of papal interventions on that regard. Yeah. But again, I'd have to have more time to talk about the nature of schism, which I'm assuming I could do.
You have 1 minute.
Yeah.
All right. And so, last question: are you aware that obviously Imperial Russia, from the 1600s on, was in ascendancy, reconquering lands that were taken by the Poles, Lithuanians, etc., into pretty much World War I, and that during that time there was official toleration of Uniates, of Latin Rite Roman Catholics for centuries. What do you think the significance of that is? Because when the shoe was on the other foot, it went the other way.
Well, I think the significance is this, that there was a reason for the Uniates to assemble outside of the jurisdiction of the Eastern Chalcedonian Orthodox churches who were schismatic. That's one. Now, to have a Latin and a Uniate bishopric in one town, the most we could say to that is it was tolerated, and if it was supported, it was against the canons.
Okay. So now, Eric, you have 6 minutes to cross-examine Craig, beginning now.
Okay. After the Council of Chalcedon, we see that the Eastern bishops floated the 28th canon, which said Constantinople was ascended to second place in the order of the patriarchs. Pope Leo wrote in response to that, claiming on the authority of Peter to annul that canon. And he wrote several letters about this to different people in the East, including the emperor. The patriarch of Constantinople at the time was Anatolius, also venerated in the East. And he wrote back to the Pope and said that the decrees of the council are in the hands of the Pope himself. And both he and the Emperor Marcian accepted Leo's annulment of that canon. Now, that canon doesn't go into Byzantine canon law for some time until the 6th century. If an ecumenical council is the highest authority in the church, and after it's accomplished, a pope can come along and delete one of its decrees, would that entail that the pope is higher than the council?
No, and for several reasons, which I think are very important. One, as we know, Leo initiated the council. He was the invisible chair of that council. His legate sat for him. It would have need reception of all parties involved for that canon to be in force, which it didn't. And we see that even issue why St. Theodore the Studite didn't accept Nicaea II, because he was under the impression, wrongly, by the way, that Rome never accepted Nicaea II. That being said, why was there, let's say, less fight in Constantinople? And I think there's a really good reason why. The reason is, one, like we know in section 16, I believe it's verse 31, Eusebius, Bishop of Darlium, says, I signed willingly since I myself read this very canon. This is canon 3 of Constantinople 1, which says pretty much the same thing as canon 28 of Chalcedon. to the most holy Pope in the presence of the clerics of Constantinople, and he accepted it. All right. In Latin, canons, they all include Canon 3 at Constantinople. And I saw this in two different scholars when I've read up on the issue. So it seems to me I'm forgetting his name right now in Constantinople, the bishop there in Chalcedon, but they already had everything they wanted. It's sort of similar to Roman concessions in Constantinople IV about the filioque. They already had everything they wanted. So they already had Canon 3. They knew Leo accepted Canon 3. I think some of his letters on that note were somewhat disingenuous, being that he accepted Canon 3. We also have the fact that we have other canons like Canon 9 that already gave appellate jurisdiction to Constantinople, which pretty much took almost everything away from Rome, because most of this stuff was Eastern churches disputing amongst each other, though in reality it's consistent with Sordicea in my view. So to me, they weren't going to push the issue with Leo because they wanted his acceptance of the meat of the council. And he already accepted the meat of Constantinople claims, at least on paper. Whether he really felt that happy about them is a whole other story. The main issue that Leo took issue with was the wording in Chalcedon in Canon 28 that said that his charism came from the fact he was in the seat of the old empire, which is clearly, not even patristic, quite frankly. That's what he took issue with, not with otherwise the meat and potatoes of Canon 28, because he accepted Canon 3. And otherwise, Canon 9, all these things are consistent with that. So I would think the answer to your question would lie with them viewing they already have everything they want. They want him to accept the rest of the council. And he was the invisible chair of that council. So you would need the person who's actually the president of the council to accept it as well. It would be necessary for reception of the council.
Okay. So what would you say about the Council of Ephesus? When did that become ecumenical? Since John of Antioch did not accept it, the Antiochian diocese was not in acceptance of it, and obviously Constantinople.
Yes. Long story short, a council is ecumenical by virtue of the Holy Spirit speaking through the bishops. This is explicit, and pretty much all the minutes of all the ecumenical councils I can get my hands on, and that are extant, because we don't really have them for a Constantinople one, for example. So that being said, Ephesus 1 was ecumenical, if we mean by ecumenical, authoritative, the moment it was done. It was received in Antioch, from that later creed that he gave, and then Cyril of Alexandria accepted it, and then he kind of went away with that later in life. And so I think that's an epistemological issue that a lot of people get confused from, and I don't find it that confusing. There's a difference between what makes it authoritative and people accepting what's authoritative. The scriptures are always authoritative, but the canon took centuries to develop. Doesn't mean they were any less authoritative as the canon was developing. So if you want to ask, when did Ephesus 1 become canonical, it would have been when Antioch accepted it.
15 seconds.
So would you say the Council of Florence became canonical when the successor of Joseph accepted it in Constantinople? Metroponus, I think is his name. I can't pronounce it correctly. Mm-hmm. But, as you know, Mark of Ephesus at the council said that if the patriarch who succeeds Joseph would receive the council, he would submit to it. But Metroponus, who was elected and ordained to the See of Constantinople and accepted the Council of Florence, did it then become canonical?
We're out of time, but Craig, just take a couple seconds to respond.
Of course not, because the Eastern Patriarchs and the Synod in 1443 all denounced it. So we're tortured into submission, starved. Athanasius didn't hold it against Pope Liberius when he signed onto the Council of Sirmium, or however you pronounce its creed, because he said he was tortured. So how can we take people being tortured, and then when they go back, here's what I did under torture, and their patriarchs disown it? The bishop, I think Isidore of Kiev, is chased out of town and almost killed. So no, clearly Florence was not accepted. That would be an absurd proposition.
Okay, now we have our closing statements. We originally were going to do 2 minutes apiece. I'm not sure if y'all are okay with this, but we're kind of behind on time, and we have a lot of chat questions. So do y'all want to maybe do 7 minutes apiece closing, or do y'all want to still stick to the 10?
I'm okay with 10. That's up to him.
Okay. Y'all want to still stick to 10? As long as y'all can stay over that, that's fine.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so Craig, you're going to start with your closing statement beginning now, 10 minutes.
I have to say this has been a great debate. I am very appreciative for Eric's time. I'm very appreciative for Mike for providing this venue. I'm appreciative of the listeners of this program. This is, I think, the highest level conversation, which is like publicly available, perhaps like not behind closed doors somewhere, that people have access to on this issue. I think this what we have tonight is awesome. I'm appreciative to be part of it. I thank God for that. That being said, it's also an issue so important because it's so tragic. And the tragedy of it is, I think, this issue, this schism, is the result of us distancing ourselves from the mind of the apostles, from that we see in the scriptures and we see preserved by the fathers. We see an absolute consensus of the fathers and in the scriptures that schism is pretty simple. It's you left, you started with the church, that's a schism. What we saw tonight when I pressed Eric through all these historical examples and how sadly one-sided they are, though I was hoping someone would bring up the eparchy of Kelm, but that never happened, that they're so one-sided in each situation. Eric said, yes, there's an injustice. Rome did that. They definitely did that. Yes, there's injustice. They did that. They definitely. It was definitely Rome's fault that happened. Then you have to ask yourself, well, then, at what point did the East ever do anything schismatic in all this over centuries? We're not even. It's like so much of this debate, sadly, popularly, is like, oh, these two guys got an argument in 1054, and that ruined everything. And it's so simplistic. It's so inaccurate. It's so idiotic. It's a waste of viewers' time. But when we get to the meat potatoes. And this is something where I couldn't in good conscience be a Roman Catholic. When I first perceived these issues, I found that schism was a sin. Because it's so categorical how wrong Rome is. If we do not presume upon the presupposition that if you're not communing in Rome, you are in schism, just like the Roman Catechism says. But no one stated that. We find Roman Catechism in church history for 1,000 years. And when the Roman Church makes their claims, they distort the manuscript record when it's in big audience. Yeah, you could find a guy there maybe saying something nice, this isolated example, but this came up in ecumenical councils and Rome hid it. This is such a true, important document, a doctrine. Why was it hidden? And like I said, we can get into the minutes of these councils, but it's in plain sight. It's to me, it's inexcusable. And I don't see it as a contradiction that people look at the East and they see us almost as this time capsule. And it's not because we haven't had developments. We've elaborated upon energy essence distinction. We've got, I think, more firm on the filioque than I think the early church did. So there's been new theological, doctrinal advancements, but not changes. I think everyone notices that the Orthodox Church hasn't changed. And we have tons of problems, definitely tons of problems. But it's because we are the church. God has preserved us despite all of our sin. And I don't think it's contradictory that the historical record and what the scriptures say about schism, what the fathers say about schism, that they're all consistent without going into any sort of elaboration, lawyer-like talk. A kid in the schoolyard would get this, yeah, he started the fight. And you go, oh, well, it's not right to say who started it. But yet I flat out read fathers say, yes, you separated, not us. I even have a letter to Cyprian I didn't read where Cyprian said, and now because you separated from us, we should have no association with you. So there's nothing wrong with once someone goes into schism, disowning them, which is what the Orthodox Church, sadly, after centuries, not right away, but after centuries, has done with the West. And it's tragic because I think it's going to take generations for this to be healed, even with the best of intentions, which I think now the majority of bishops have. There's some... In the rest of my time, I'll just go over specifics about this that came up in our discussion. We always hear about the formula hormistas. We've talked about this before in the previous debate, that the Bishop of Constantinople said, I and Rome are one in this issue. So what we don't have are concessions saying, yeah, Rome, you're really special. That definitely did not exist. And so it almost seems to me it requires such a slanted look at the evidence in order to take the view Rome has. Now, a lot of this, people might say, well, you're just saying everything is this gross exaggeration that, that's your lens for interpreting all this history. But Anastasius, Pope John VIII's librarian, when translating Nicaea II for John VIII, and this was before the Council Constantinople before, wrote that inasmuch as the Greeks very improperly in the synod have frequently styled their patriarch as ecumenical, let your apostleship pardon their flattery, for they are accustomed thus reprehensibly to flatter their superiors. And then he goes into detail after that to talk about ecumenical really doesn't mean he's bishop the entire earth, et cetera, et cetera. They were well aware that they said the most audacious things about the Pope that the East really didn't take it serious. Because, to use it as an example, the early Christians would not, let's say, light incense for the emperor as part of pagan worship. But it was common practice to light incense for the Byzantine emperor, not because they were worshiping him anymore. So they were able to disassociate even the most exaggerated, somewhat almost evil, quite frankly, shows of respect and attestations of honor, because that was something so common in Byzantine culture and really that whole majority of Christendom at that time. And so I think to some extent Rome was aware of this. The manuscript record bears it out because they so clearly doctored the Latin letters versus the Greek letters. They would actually have the gumption to read. And I think what doesn't come out a lot is in these ecumenical councils, how much it's so clear, way more than any papal pretensions. People go, I've read this, I've evaluated this, therefore I accept this. This happens over and over and over. You can't read an ecumenical council where it's clear these bishops are taking it upon themselves, like in Canon 34, to accept what we have. Well, the question then is, when this debate, what's the Roman response to all this? And the Roman response pretty much is, well, you appeal to the Pope. You know Pope ain't going to agree. So you make a council, but the Pope de facto has totalitarian control over what this council really could do and whether it's accepted or not. So in reality, just like Vatican I says, the Pope doesn't need to consent. He doesn't need to acquiesce, in total contradiction of what we see in Constantinople II, when it was clearly said and accepted by Pope Vigilius that the only way, he says, the only way that the church can come to agreement on an issue is through the consent of all. All right, that's a paraphrase, but he says through the help of others. So that's what a Pope said. And what we hear back is, well, but because he accepted, but he has de facto totalitarian control. The issue with this is heretical because it's inconsistent with the Godhead, where the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, there's a submission. There's not this totalitarian control of the Father and the Godhead. There's no subordinationism. It's inconsistent with soteriology, right? We, through the grace of God in us, work with Christ to have faith and accept the grace of God and to be sanctified and be saved. Okay, this is synergistic. But what we have here is ecclesiological predestinarianism. That's decided by the Pope. He's in total control. Like you heard from Eric, the Rome could do everything wrong over centuries, but it's a shame that you're under a bad Pope. Too bad. He has total control over your salvation, because like the Pope said, there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church and those that are not in communion with the papal see. So this is just wrong at so many levels. It doesn't make any Roman Catholic a bad person. It just shows what has happened in centuries of development, going back from Pope Victor I, when we take something that's a little too exaggerated, a little too overarching, wrong-headed, and then take it to its logical extent. What we get is overt heresy. And it's clearly this heresy which separates our churches, and it's, by the grace of God, something that the Roman Church will repent from so they could take their rightful place back in the church. Like St. Theodore the Studite said, if one church goes into error, the church can maintain things. The four other patriarchal sees maintain the Orthodox faith. And this is quoted by Father Capps, who's, again, a Byzantine Catholic scholar. This is what happened. It's tragic. But the seat of Peter still exists. Not only Antioch and Alexandria, but every bishop is in the seat of Peter. Every bishop, and I didn't even read this, but St. Octavius talks about every bishop has the keys of Peter, even though it's in schism, because they have sacraments. So this is something why it's important for us to realize who started the schism, because unless we realize that, Rome's not going to stand where they doctrinally went off the beaten path so we can now bring them back in.
Okay. You had about 5 seconds there, so we're right on time. Eric, do you want to go ahead and start your 10 minutes right now?
Yeah, I'll start at 10 minutes.
All right,
Okay, so there's a couple of things which I could say here at the final, which I think makes Craig's position untenable. The first is he admits that the papal supremacy doctrine was alive in Rome in the first millennium. Let's think about that. The consequence of that would be that the head of Christendom for the first 1,000 years was already entrenched in the very heresy which has to be renounced today in order to enter into the Eastern Orthodox Church. Number two, it would also mean, like he admitted with St. Jerome, that the first 1,000 years of popes were misled as to something so basic as the understanding of their own position of leadership, that it was exaggerated, wrong-headed, etc., etc. This is the head of Christendom for the first millennium of the church. The Eastern Orthodox admit that Rome, at least for the most part, I don't know any Orthodox Christian who's going to say that the apostolic see of the first 1,000 years ever went into heresy like any other bishop did, like the See of Constantinople or the See of Jerusalem. The See of Jerusalem did go into heresy, especially during the Monothelite crisis. So the Eastern Orthodox Church claims to be the spiritual successor of the church in the first millennium. And yet, the one church, or the one side of the church, the Western, represented by the Pope, was already entrenched in the heresy of the papacy. So how can the Eastern Orthodox be the spiritual successor of the church in the first millennium if, by their own admission, the Roman See was the principal and chief representative of the Orthodox faith in the first 1,000 years? I think he welcomes and invites too much heresy into the true church. Craig talks a lot about schism and how schism starts, but he's got the wrong date. It's not during the Crusades, according to him, if we're consistent. After the Council of Chalcedon, when all the Eastern patriarchs took Chalcedon off the list and joined with the schismatic monophysites, the only way they came back into the church was through an intervention of one of these popes who was entrenched in the heresy of the papacy, Pope St. Hormisdas. That formula, which was required to be signed by the Eastern bishops in order to re-enter the church, said this: the first condition of salvation is to keep the norm of the true faith, and in no way to deviate from the established doctrine of the fathers. For it is impossible that the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," should not be verified. And their truth has been proved by the course of history, for in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion has always been kept unsullied. And so I hope I may deserve to be associated with you in one communion with the Apostolic See proclaims, in which the whole true and perfect security of the Christian religion resides. I promise that from now on, those who are separated from the communion of the Catholic Church, that is, who are not in agreement with the Apostolic See of Rome, will not have their names read during the sacred mysteries. So, if the Eastern patriarchs and bishops who signed this document in order to get back into the church, they basically admitted everything that Rome is asking of the Eastern Orthodox today. And if schism would be to set up a parallel hierarchy, then the hierarchy who agreed to this formula in the East is schismatic if it's wrong, because those who rejected the formula had to endure with their brethren leaving them to return to the Church of Rome. And these are the Coptic Christians of Egypt, who to this day will tell you that the Chalcedonian East, who left under the Emperor Justinian, are the true schismatics. So if Craig wants to say a parallel jurisdiction is where schism starts, then right here in the middle of the 6th century, we have a parallel jurisdiction in the East, several places in the East, which was created on the basis of this formula, which reads aloud the papal supremacy doctrine, which he admits was the doctrine of Rome. So we have a conundrum here. He's correct. There's a lot of points that he made that were compelling, but I don't know how he does not cut off the very branch that he's sitting on. How is it that the true church of the first millennium, the undivided church of the Greeks and the Latins, which didn't break fully until the 2nd millennium, how could it be that the papacy was merely tolerated? That they kind of said to themselves, you know, these popes who did this, they were exaggerating. I'm not sure that really does justice to what really was done here. Forget about what the formula of Hormisda says. Just look at the act itself. The Emperor Justinian writes to the West, to the Pope, and says, what do we do with the Eastern bishops? The Pope says they must agree with the Roman See. Just the act itself is an act of intervention on authoritative grounds. There are several historians who have made clear note that saints of the Eastern Orthodox Church who were popes of Rome and associates to them who were bishops in the East gave in to direct and immediate interventions of jurisdiction in the East. One example, Pope Theodore in the 7th century. He was born in Jerusalem. He was an Eastern Pope. He dispatched Stephen of Dor as a papal vicar to enter into the Diocese of Jerusalem to depose bishops and to ordain those who agreed with Rome. Pope Martin dispatched John of Philadelphia to enter into the Antiochian Diocese and the diocese under the Patriarchate of Jerusalem as well, to depose and ordain bishops who agreed with Rome. This was an Eastern Orthodox pope, right? Because, like I said, the Roman Catholic schismatic church, which Craig says is wrong, is not in existence before the Crusades. But what do we see here before the Crusades? Jerome taught the papal doctrine. Craig said he was misled. Augustine taught the papal doctrine, said that whoever severs himself from the chair of Peter is not a vine in the root. He was misled on that as well. St. Optatus of Milevis, he clearly teaches in Book 2 that the chair of Peter is established and fixed in Rome. We asked him to explain that. How could it be that the chair of Peter is in Rome as a fixed station? We didn't get an explanation on that. The explanation on that is St. Optatus taught very clearly, and scholars who are not Roman Catholic have realized this, that Optatus believed that while there's a universal dimension to every church as the chair of Peter, every bishop sits on the chair of Peter, but that's contingent upon a first link, which is the true historic chair of Peter in the See of Rome. And we know that because later on in Book 2, Chapter 9, of against Majorinus, or against the Donatists, St. Optatus says that of all the adornments in the church, there has been ordained one representative. And the representative that he's referring there, again, Chapter 9 of Book 2, you'll read it, he's referring back to the episcopal lineage of the Roman See. And so All I would have to say here is that the case for Eastern Orthodoxy that has been presented also falls on the same branch if Rome falls, because Eastern Orthodox has to absorb the heresy of papalism that she tolerated for the first 1,000 years. As Craig has admitted here and in other venues, the papal doctrine was believed at least in Rome. His explanation is that those in the East or those in the West besides Rome who spoke about Rome, it was, you're special. But I challenge any of the readers here to go read the history behind the Council of Constantinople III, which came forth after the Council of Lateran 649. In that council, we have Sergius of Cyprus, Stephen of Dor, the African episcopate. We have a letter from Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem. And what do they admit? And what do Byzantine scholars to this day admit? Is that they understood that there was a crisis that required a doctrinal judge, and they understood that Rome was qualified to speak to it because of the investiture that she has received from the chair of Peter, which was divinely ordained by Jesus Christ in the apostle as a divine law to exist until the end of this world's history.
All right. Well, that concludes the debate portion, but I want to get into some questions. Let me first ask you all a few questions, and then we'll get into the chat ones. You don't have to answer anything prolonged for these. Focus more on the chat questions, but if you want to give me just kind of a brief answer, that'd be helpful. First question is for Craig. So is schismaticy a scholastic technical term, or did you make that up?
I'm sure it's a technical term. I think I've seen it somewhere.
All right, I'll check that off my list. All right, so no, in all seriousness, okay. So how would you determine objectively who is in schism? Just a quick summary answer, because I still wasn't really getting that.
The same you would find out who punched you in the face.
Mm-hmm.
You feel that big punch in your face, and go, that guy punched me in the face. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we make this into rocket science when it's not.
Okay. So what do you do about parallel jurisdictions in Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, in the United States, although they, generally recognize each other as in communion with each other? What do you do with parallel jurisdictions if parallel jurisdictions is the evidence of a schism?
Parallel jurisdictions are cancerous. And so what Eric was referring to in point of the debate is like, well, was Athanasius out of the church when he didn't observe, the bishop of Antioch and this and that? And the answer would be not precisely, because we have that situation now. Moscow is not in communion with Constantinople. Antioch's not in communion with Jerusalem, but other members of the church are in communion with those parties. And so that maintains an overall communion. This really doesn't create a massive epistemological issue for Orthodoxy, because we don't have this view that the whole church is anchored on this one bishop in which the whole world stands or falls. It does create issues for the papacy's claims, because the idea would be that then how can Meletius be a saint his whole life, not in communion with Rome? It's not good enough for him, he was in communion, I'll just make one up, with the bishop of Thessalonica, and he was in communion with Rome or something like that. That's not good enough. He was not in communion with Rome. So he would have been just fine by the Orthodox standards of, what's in schism, but not the Roman standards. My last comment on this, to say real quickly, would be the parallel jurisdictions after the Crusade were much more delineated than what we see in modern Orthodoxy today. Where there's 4 parallel jurisdictions right now in the city of Syracuse. No one by the force of arms is kicking anyone else's priests out of town. Right, so it's a sign of a cancer. We should not have 4 different bishops for the city of Syracuse, New York. That should definitely not be the case. It's a sign of a cancer. But a sign of death is that, no, don't observe your altars. Your bishop is gone. This is now mine. It's the same error that we read about in 3 John.
Okay.
Are you aware that Pope Francis in 2015 declared Gregory Narak, an Armenian, not only a saint, but a doctor of the church? How do you deal with that, since he was outside of communion with Rome his entire life? And here you have not only Rome recognizing that he's a saint, but actually making him a doctor of the church. How does this, how does
Oh,
this
I
fare
think
with what you were saying?
it shows how far Roman Catholic theology has fallen. If you can't trust your own saint canonizations, you have major problems. Even Vatican II says there's no salvation outside the Roman Catholic Church. You know, I can't say that orthodoxy is totally about sin in this regard. However, I mean, we have Saint Isaac the Syrian. You know, as far as we know, he was an Nestorian bishop. I don't know what conspiracy theories exist, because he was only a bishop for 1 year. I don't know what conspiracy theories exist that, you know, he left that and he was secretly Orthodox in his heart. We know that in Greece and in the Czech lands, that even Jan Hus and Jerome Krog are venerated. So that means at least they're canonized, maybe not like by the rule by a patriarchate like Cairo Lucaris or something like that. So we have that issue. I would say we should not be informed by that by either of our sides, because then you really have to ask Eric this question. That this means, okay, this is who are such and such is in schism. Rather, this more shows that the church is aware that there's no salvation outside the church. That is the rule, but that there's certain exceptions for reasons that are mysterious, right? Like, you know, we believe generally, this is tradition, that Trajan's in heaven. What bishop was he in communion with when he died? Obviously nobody. So I think it'd probably be more helpful to view that issue within that lens. As for Rome saying now he's a doctor of the church, you'd have to ask Eric that question. To me, that sounds ridiculous.
Okay. So last question. What do you do with Eric's claim that you have these Orthodox popes prior to the schism who make very interesting statements that seem to substantiate papal supremacy, or at least the notion that one has to be in communion with the See of Rome in order to be part of the universal church? And he mentioned the formula for Hormisdas. What do you do with the Orthodox popes who seem to have that language?
I mean, actually, that doesn't bother me too much for two reasons. One, like I said, it does not appear that they went 100%. My belief is that they did believe that an ecumenical council could appeal them for all intents and purposes. And we read proof of this because when issues of the Filioque and stuff came up in the 8th and 9th centuries, they flat out said, well, I cannot change what an ecumenical council has done. So this is something that I think shows that the popes had some sort of right place where they view themselves vis-a-vis the authority of the church at large. And second, I would flip that question back at Eric in that case. We have saints that, again, venerated by Roman Catholics that don't meet that criteria, that explicitly contradicted that Roman view, right? We talked about St. Malatius. We talk about the Council Fathers, for example, of Chalcedon, who called the legates Nestorians, I think in verse 5 of session 16. I mean, they called them Nestorians for Pete's sake, because at first the legates wouldn't accept their definition, and they wanted the Toma Leo in isolation to be that definition, which ultimately the legates backed off from. Chalcedon went and made its own definition, but then borrowed language from the Toma Leo, and that was the compromise foisted upon the bishops from the imperial government. So I think the problem's actually bigger for Eric. I mean, we got no problem saying, some guys had some theological issues, but we see them as saints. How does Eric, see that you've got saints that directly contradict Roman ecclesiology, refuse to submit to it, and they're canonized? When the Roman definition is that you must affirm this. I mean, I just don't see how it's possible.
Okay. Eric, so a couple questions for you, and then we'll get to the chat questions. Did Maximus the Confessor indicate in any kind of way that schism with the Pope is schism from the universal church? I know that there are some quotes from him that seem to indicate, even if Rome goes into heresy, he won't follow Rome. But then there's some other passages from Maximus that seem to mitigate that statement. So again, is there anything in Maximus that would indicate schism with the Pope is schism from the universal church?
Yeah, there's a letter that he wrote to an Eastern official named Peter. And this is what he wrote. He said, if the Roman See recognizes Pyrrhus to be not only a reprobate, but a heretic, it is certainly plain that everyone who anathematizes those who have rejected Pyrrhus anathematizes the See of Rome. That is, he anathematizes the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
I need hardly add that he excommunicates himself also, if indeed he is in communion with the Roman See and the Church of God. It is not right that one who has been condemned and cast out by the Apostolic See of the city of Rome for his wrong opinions should be named with any kind of honor until he be received by her back in forgiveness, having returned to her and to our Lord by a pious confession in Orthodox faith. I could go on, but yeah, that's the letter. If readers want to know, look up Maximus's letter to Peter, official of the East.
Now, okay, so let's grant that. What do you do with the part where it seems to indicate, that Maximus says, even if, Rome is in heresy, I won't follow Rome?
Yeah, so if you read that interview that his interrogators have with him, that's not his first response. His first response is that he didn't believe it was possible.
Mhm.
So when they asked him again, they're putting him under pressure. So his answer has to be seen in that light, that
Mhm.
this could be for the sake of argument. We also have to recognize that after that interrogation, he wrote a letter to one of his disciples. I believe his name was, I can't recall the name. He had a disciple and a friend that had the same name, but he wrote a letter basically to inquire about this. And that letter was then sent to the West. And in that letter, at the end of it, it is an appended section. So it's probably not Maximus himself, but it was probably his disciple that wrote it. Basically said, we believe that the promise of Christ rests on the Roman See. So their inquiry into this claim that Rome was basically going into communion with the monothelites is basically, well, we believe that this is impossible, but here are these claims, and we want to know what's really going on. And I can tell you right now, if I was in Maximus's shoes, I might say the same thing.
Okay. All right. So what do you do with Father Cleanerwork, who in his book that deals with the papacy and the differences between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, his broken body is the title. What do you do with his understanding of the universal church and what constitutes schism? How would you interact with what he says in his work?
Well, I think Father Cleanerwork does an excellent job because he goes back to the patristic understanding of the chair of Peter, which is one of the reasons why I cross-examined Craig on this issue, because Craig wants to believe that each bishop sits on the chair of Peter vis-a-vis his diocese. But I'm not sure if Craig or Cleanerwork want to admit that Peter had the same kind of episcopal jurisdiction over the apostles. The second thing is that it's good to recognize the Eucharistic local ecclesiology of the fathers and to recognize that the chair of Peter resides in each bishopric. But it's also tied in with all of these teachings by the contemporaries of the 4th century, like Jerome, Augustine, Optatus of Milevis, who say that while there is a chair of Peter in every diocese, the universal network is linked up into one by its communion with the source, the font, the source of the ray, as Cyprian calls it in his De Unitate. And that is the chair of Peter in Rome, where the episcopal lineage they give the names for, which is clear that it's talking about Rome and not just every loose episcopate. Because if that were the case, then the chair of Peter is as a blank check. Every bishop can say he's the chair of Peter. But what Optatus tells us is, in order to legitimize your status as the chair of Peter, there's two things. You're in communion with the Roman See, and by extension, with all the bishoprics of the world.
Okay, well let's narrow it down from every bishop. Let's narrow it down to Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, the Petrine sees. So you have Seraphim, Hamilton, and many others who make the claim that okay, these are all referenced as being sees that were found by Peter. So would it not be the case that um, to be separated from all of these sees would constitute schism? Why is Rome singled out as a Petrine see?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Peter did go to Antioch first, and Roman Catholics believe he held the universal primacy. However, when he left Antioch, he didn't leave his universal primacy there, because the universal primacy can only be had by one. So it wasn't as if when Peter came to Antioch, he was the universal primate, and then the person who took his place after him was the second universal primate. So Antioch does have an honorific lineage from Peter. It's a real form and matter, but it's not a succession to the universal primacy. Then Mark was sent to Egypt in Alexandria. That's not Peter himself, but it's accorded with the fullness of Peter's traditions. We read that in an epistle from Leo to the Church of Alexandria, where he says, how could anyone think that Alexandria would be at odds with Rome when Peter sent his foremost disciple, Mark, to found the church in Alexandria? Peter went to Rome, and that's where it was deposited, his universal primacy. Alexandria and Antioch do not obtain that kind of succession, even though they have a strong co-relationship with the primacy of Peter.
All right, really quickly, because I want to get to the chat.
Yeah, no, take your time.
Yeah, I don't want to take away from that, but this is another one that I've really seen come up a lot. Okay, so would you say that there's a full schism between the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox, or would you say that there's a part schism? And let me just preface it by saying we know that Roman Catholicism teaches that the Eastern Orthodox exercise legitimate jurisdiction and also have valid sacraments and constitute a local church. Correct me if I'm wrong about any of that, but that
right.
Seems to be the case from what I've seen. And then you also just read a quote from Augustine where he says they retain the shape of the vine but are cut off from the root. Is it the case that the Eastern Orthodox retain these things but are entirely severed from the root, so they're entirely in schism? Or would you say that there's maybe a mitigated circumstance here and that the Eastern Orthodox are just maybe to a lesser extent in schism and maybe there's just a partial severance here? How would you characterize this?
Yeah, I would say that it is, unfortunately, it is a full schism. There are strong ties, and that's the only reason why there's strong ties is because as Catholics, we believe that the episcopal miracle of ordination is not obliterated even when you enter into schism. This is one of the issues that, we quabble with some of the East about. So when you get hired in God's kingdom as a bishop, you get some extraordinary powers. And even if you go off the true church and start your own thing, those powers can be extremely dangerous now because you can use it against the true church, but those powers are not obliterated. So Augustine saw this with the Donatists. They had everything. They had everything, and they may even looked better because they were good at weeding out unworthy people. But they did not have the sap of the root, even though the branch might be more pretty and beautiful. And their functioning sacraments, according to Augustine, while they were valid, so they had the power to sanctify, but the recipients could not be sanctified because their interior disposition had a big, huge brick wall because of the schism that they were in. But he does envision the possibility of somebody getting baptized in a Donatist church if he couldn't find a baptism anywhere else, and that it would have the power of sanctification. So that strain of logic and extend it, and you have what we believe about the Orthodox Church today.
Well,
Can I
it
offer
seems
a
like.
comment on
Oh,
that?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Craig.
I just want to say, like, without really giving an answer, I just want to make the observation that the Melkites and the Antiochian Orthodox in Lebanon will observe intercommuning with one another in times of death. And this is not just one renegade priest doing this. That's something all Arabs know in that area, all the Christians. And so in some respects, the communion between the Melkites and the Antiochian Orthodox is more profound than Russia's and Constantinople's today. I don't know the significance of that. I'm even confused by it, but something probably worth pointing out.
That's a very, very interesting observation. But Eric, one thing is, power of the sacraments and validity is one thing. Exercising legitimate jurisdiction while completely out of schism, and as you indicated, it's a full schism, seems to be another, is it not?
Yeah, so here we're going into a very difficult canonical investigation on the power to absolve. The Orthodox bishops don't have any authority to teach, so they wouldn't carry any juridical capacity as a teacher. So they have no capacity to give teaching acts, in other words. But we have this quirky idea that amongst the sacraments that are valid, also the sacrament of penance, which requires jurisdiction. And I believe, and this one gets a little bit more technical because of the Orthodox understanding of the sacrament of marriage. But yeah, that's, I'm still looking into that. I've asked a lot of canon lawyers, and it seems like it's a little bit more difficult than I realize. To me, at first, it looked kind of like a full-blown illegal concession. But yeah, I'd have to look more into it to give you a fuller, in-depth answer. But I could tell you that the Orthodox don't have power of teaching. They don't have jurisdiction in that sense, and they don't have the power to excommunicate, for example. Like if they were to pass judgment on a Catholic for, it wouldn't be within their purview anyway. But if one of them, if an Eastern Orthodox person left Orthodoxy to join Catholicism, for example, the Orthodox bishop would not have the authority to bind in that regard, because it would go contrary to the keys established in the Catholic episcopate.
I suppose what you mean by teaching, though, is in their jurisdiction, because we clearly see a lot of the Orthodox, involved in synods convoked by Pope Francis, and their input is, welcomed, and they are given the public platform to speak. So I suppose you're referring to teaching and preaching in a diocese, correct?
Yeah, not only that, but also in a council, because they would have at most the same influence that a pariti or the philosopher or a theologian would have, or an atheist. An atheist might be invited to an ecumenical council.
You would see them more as a pariti than an actual bishop speaking to the council.
Yeah, they could not act as a bishop. No.
Okay, Craig, I have a question from CS in the chat. He asks, by your logic in the opening, the Anglicans are not in schism. Is that correct? Then aren't the Orthodox churches sinning by not recognizing them?
I don't follow that logic. The Anglicans were in communion with Rome for centuries into the schism. So I wouldn't accept that conclusion.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So the next question is for Eric. What are the Catholic arguments to justify that the Council of Florence ended the schism?
Well, that's how it ended. It ended with the idea that the schism between the Greeks and the Latins was over. There was a lot of concern over Mark of Ephesus and his refusal to sign on to the council. He did say that if the Patriarch of Constantinople signed afterwards, the successor appointed in Constantinople, because you'll recall Rome wanted to ordain a Patriarch for Constantinople right on the spot. but the emperor said it would be impossible to do that because they'd have to do it back home to follow the canons. So the successor accepted the council, and the legates of the other patriarchs, there's no indication in any account of the history of Florence that their acceptance of the council was contingent upon their patriarchs' acceptance when they came back. I mean, I sympathize that, they said, well, what'd you do that over there? You basically went into heresy, I get it. But there doesn't seem to be any of that legatine conditional where, coming back to the East, that, all of a sudden it's not recognized. You have a schism between the Unionists and the anti-Unionists in Constantinople and in the other eastern parts, and also up in the up through the Balkans to Russia. You have this infighting amongst them, but the Pope was cited at the liturgy in Constantinople, I think of 1453. But again, that was seen as a schismatic act by the anti-Unionists. So I would say it's a failed council. Don't get me wrong. I don't think it has secured union. It's completely failed. But I think the Orthodox have had to develop a new understanding of what it means for the Church to possess the power of doctrinal teaching, and for official judgments to be given. They've had to refine it so that there's always an open door to correct what they've decreed, and that's led to one of the criticisms that we've had with the Orthodox.
Craig, Dustin asks, and sorry about this, it's a little lengthy, but I want to read the whole thing. Is the unilateral assertion of the filioque in the creed by Rome an example of overstepping in novelty in terms of the power of the papacy? If yes, are you aware that in a letter to Pope Saint Damasus, Saint Jerome implored the Pope to make a new creed superseding the Nicene, if necessary, to make the nature of Christ more clear to heretics? As early as 300s, it was believed a Pope could unilaterally make a new creed. Doesn't the insertion of one word pale by comparison?
Short answer, I would say yes. And what Jerome did wasn't canonically wrong, because there was no canon passed that you can't change the creed. That happened in Ephesus 1. It was reiterated in Chalcedon. I don't think it was mentioned again in Constantinople 2, but Constantinople 3, it explicitly said you can't change the creed. And again, in Constantinople, in Nicaea 2, the same thing happened again. And then we have popes, like I said, Leo III, John VIII. Same thing, same effect. We have a papally ratified council, Constantinople 479 880 says the same thing. So Jerome would have been, I guess, technically correct. It would have not been against the canons at that time for the Pope to do it. But the Apostles' Creed was a creed without any ecumenical council. I mean, it had the reception of the church, and that's essentially ecumenical in authority. But it's so what Jerome did not say also would be that we got to change Nicaea 1 in the way that the Arian councils were doing. I mean, the Arian councils were flat out changing words in it that contradicted Nicaea 1. Obviously, Jerome was not doing that, and therefore he was not ascribing something to the Pope that would have contradicted the statements of Leo III, John VIII, statements in the ecumenical councils, etc.
But doesn't it seem odd that you have a Pope, a saint telling the Pope that he could unilaterally change the Nicene Creed without the approval of an ecumenical council? Isn't that odd?
I mean, again, you'd have to read explicitly the statement, but it's not odd for a Pope or anyone else to make a creed. I mean, someone has to write the creeds before they're accepted.
To replace,
and especially that time. One thing that comes up is there was pretty much for the first, 600 years, 700 years of the church, really only two patriarchates that really avoided mega problems, okay? And that would be Jerusalem and Rome. I mean, Rome, they had a few issues. They had Liberius, they had Honorius, they had a couple of Theopaschite popes, and be honest, I'm not even sure how profound that issue is, though it is condemned in Nicaea too. So he had a little bit of issues. We had the issue with Saint Juvenal. He did sign on to Ephesus 2, though the minutes in Nicaea 2 they claim, but he was silent about the doctrinal matters. He just signed on about the jurisdictional crap. So what we have is, with so much of the church, trying to make a different creed, different Nicaea one, I wouldn't read too much into Jerome's statement that means he thinks that the Pope in isolation can essentially do something ecumenical in authority. I mean, he didn't say that. So how could we ascribe to him meaning that if he didn't say it?
Well, here's what he said. If you think fit, enact a decree, and then I shall not hesitate to speak of 3 hypostases. Order a new creed to supersede the Nicene, and then whether we are Arians or Orthodox, one confession will do for us all.
Okay, but again, supersede. What does Constantinople I supersede Nicaea? Yes, in that it adds to that creed and that it has authority, but it doesn't replace it. So the question would be, did Jerome view that supersession equivalent to what a Constantinople I or a definition in Chalcedon, where then it becomes binding to the same degree of effect, where there had been no recourse if people disagreed?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I would not concede that he would have viewed absolutely no recourse for all time, because he didn't say that.
Yeah, no, I agree with partly what you're saying here. It's just odd that he's not saying you in union with an ecumenical council or anything.
Because again, we're ripping these quotes from guys out of context. When you look at this holistically, it becomes very clear they thought there had to be a council. They really thought people really had to accept the stuff. People really thought the Pope was not the end all be all. This is all ad nauseum. And if you actually go into the nitty gritty,
can I say something to that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, Craig is refuted by one of his own saints that the Orthodox Church venerates, Paulinus of Aquileia. He was a Carolingian theologian. He's venerated by the Eastern Orthodox. If you read Father Aidan Nichols' Rome and the Eastern Churches, page 237 and 238, he talks about Paulinus of Aquileia, who argued that the Pope had the authority to add to the creed on the basis that it's the same faith. In other words, so he's speaking well after the Council of Chalcedon, and there's many voices in that regard. He mentions the popes, and during the Pope John and Pope Leo III, there are other popes who have said other things which make it clear that they believe they had that authority. So this claim that no one had this view, it's completely gratuitous, and it's I don't know a single scholar who would agree with Craig there.
By the way, I'm trying to solidify.
I'm sorry, go ahead. It's pretty clear that this is something that you cannot do. We have Pope saying that. I think we're understanding some of the quotations of these people out of context. We have by far more in the councils ad nauseum on this topic.
Trying to actually solidify a date with Father Aidan Nichols to come on the show. So maybe when I get a response from him, we can maybe discuss this a little bit further with him.
Right.
Greg, there's another question for you. Do you believe that Rome only served as a locus of unity for a period of time? If so, who is now the locus of unity? Russia, Mount Athos, Greece?
Sadly, it's Bartholomew. That's obviously where that focal point is right now.
Okay. Let's see. Craig, why do Orthodox have why do Orthodox have no problem with the fact that it took years, decades, and even centuries for doctrine to be defined, but for the papacy to be valid, it must be immediate?
I don't get it. Maybe you could give me your interpretive gloss to that question.
I think what he's saying is that, you have the reception view within Orthodoxy, receiving a dogma. If it's been received long-term, then it's considered authoritative. But it seems there's an inconsistency when it comes to the way the Orthodox view the papacy, because the Orthodox want to have those papal claims be accepted immediately in order for them to be considered valid. Does that make sense?
I suppose. I guess the test of time would be, were these papal claims something that the whole church accepted? Does it meet the criteria, St. Vincent de Lorenz, of, consent, obviously universality, antiquity. And I'd argue, again, 90% antiquity, definitely not consent, definitely not universality.
Okay.
So it would miss all those absolutely necessary criteria of St. Vincent de Lorenz.
Eric, this is kind of related to what I asked you. Patty asks, from the Roman Catholic perspective, is it correct to say that the Orthodox churches are part of the Roman Catholic Church?
It's a little bit of a nuanced answer. So basically, the Roman Catholic Church teaches that the one Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church under the Pope. But there are elements of sanctification which exist outside of the visible boundaries of the Church. These are ecclesial realities. They're not extra ecclesial realities, but there are forces which impel Catholic unity. So the Church of Christ is working outside of its visible boundaries. The chief and closest society would be the Eastern Orthodox, but they would not be considered part of the visible constitution, the visible society under the Pope. No.
Okay. Trying to decipher some of these questions, so not really getting them, so I'll have to pass over them. Let me scroll down here.
I have a question for Craig, if I could count as one of
Yeah,
these.
go ahead while I'm looking.
I see Eric in the crowd when I look at the YouTube, so that means he can ask questions.
Craig talked about universality. If he admits that there were popes that held to the papal heresy, and that this was the doctrine of Rome, would you say that anti-papalism lacks the character of universality because you admit that Rome had this mistaken idea for so many years?
I would say that's an excellent question, and actually that's a question. I think that is the main weakness for the Orthodox case. And I have this book that I'm still yet to finish, and I touch on it in my chapter on the topic. The best I could understand is this, if I could argue the party line, right? Which would be, being that popes relented, they consented to Eastern claims. After Victor, that did not persist. After Stephen, the excommunication for Millian, who kept living for decades, did not persist. That ultimately needs to be concessions to the Eastern view. I think, though, more consistently speaking, it'd probably be more charitable to believe the Roman view, like I said, 90% is correct or negotiable or workable, and that any popes that might have went beyond it in something extreme, like Stephen I, or Victor, which didn't have the authority against the consent of the whole world to do what they did, they should be considered the outliers, not the Leo the Thirds, not the John the Eighths. God bless you. I don't know what that, because it's choppy. I don't know if it's sneeze or a cough, but may God bless you anyway. So I would say that's a good question. I do not think that it's something that cannot be explained. I do understand that the explanation is not the most compelling, awesome thing out there either.
We got a question for you, Eric. How does Rome, this is from CS, how does Rome recover from manuscript corruptions and lies like donation of Constantine? Say that it was an accident, it's just irrelevant. I guess he's saying that, Rome says it was just an accident, or was this just irrelevant? Not sure I understand that last part, but how do you deal with manuscript corruptions and lies from Rome?
Yeah, well, I would say manuscript corruptions is a problem that everyone has. But with regard to those forgeries that were trying to beef up the Pope, none of the claims of the papacy were grounded in these documents. If you deleted those documents, you'd still have enough undisputable records which prove the same with regard to the religious primacy of the Roman See. The other thing I would say is that the reason why they wrote that forgery was because it was already a belief prior to the forgery. So while there is a forgery, it doesn't necessarily mean that the belief itself has an origin with the forgery. Now, that doesn't mean that the belief itself is good. It could be a bad one. But like I said, take away all those forgeries of pseudo Isidore, and you still have enough. You have a manuscript record that nobody disputes that amounts to the same thing.
Okay. I'd like to offer a comment on that, and not really necessarily a combative one. I personally take a very conservative view of manuscripts. I think, and this goes back to the Renaissance, quite frankly. I think readers have been too reflexive to think, oh, this is inconsistent with his thought. This language does not look like what the guy really wrote. This manuscript is not recent and it's too recent for this to be a legitimate manuscript going back to the original. It's, I think, overly critical and undoes a lot of history, and it's inconsistent with what we know about humanity. I mean, I could Google Eric Ybarra in, I think, 2013 or 2012, and up until weeks before he became Roman Catholic, he's arguing the Anglican position for St. Irenaeus. If we are looking at Eric Ybarra in the future and the scraps of, what's left of the internet after Judgment Day and Skynet and all that stuff, I think so that's pseudo Eric Ybarra, that's real Eric Ybarra. To me, it's so absurd the way we approach manuscripts. So I say, unless it's like really ridiculous, like obviously we have certain Gnostic Gospels where it's clearly they're not apostolic. Clearly, like we would say with certain manuscripts where they're not mentioned for the first time. I'll use a real obscure one, other than the donation of Constantine. Let's just use the Council of Antioch, the minutes that are retained in the Apostolic Constitution, the canons rather. I mean, no one ever mentioned them ever before then. So like they probably were the canons of some sort of real council, maybe in Antioch or that area. But I mean, no one takes seriously that they really were made by the apostles. And it doesn't seem like people at the time really did too, even though sometimes they're quoted in the affirmative, even in ecumenical councils. So I think we can have a healthy skepticism for like the really absurd, manuscripts and traditions where we know clearly these had to be made up. But in the same way, I think that we can have too much of a skepticism. And so that way, my approach when I look at the history is to presume, unless it's ridiculous, it's all real. And see, well, then how's it all work, presuming they're all real? And I think Eric would be right. There's enough meat for the Roman Catholic side to work with where they can say, yes, the pseudo-Isidorian decretals or whatever they're called, yes, they're not real, but it's because they were trying to make more real something they already believed, something they already wrote about, and stuff to that effect. They just wanted earlier authority. They wanted to quote, St. Clement of Rome to make it look like he really said this stuff, which, probably something like Pope Victor said or something like that. So I don't think it totally undoes the Roman position. I want to add one other dorky comment on this note because I think it's very important, and I saw a chat comment against this. You cannot deny massive manuscript differences between Latin and Greek letters, particularly from popes to councils. I think the only honest way to look at this, especially when sometimes it comes out there is a Latin tradition that matches the Greek, is not that always the Latin letter really was totally made up centuries afterwards, which I'm going to guess some scholars will probably take that view, but I wouldn't even take that view. I think the better view is that they wrote let's say, a lack of better term, a canonical letter. And pretty much, let's say, the Pope said to the legate, go to Constantinople with this and see if you could get away with it. I know you probably won't. And he goes to Rome, and if he kind of sends feelers out there and finds out, I could say this, and they're going to accept it, and it's not going to create a big issue. Like Agatho's letter, for example. Agatho's letter in Constantinople III has minimal changes between Latin and Greek, and I think there's certain vague things there on purpose. But there's like only one sentence where it's clearly been changed not to offend the Greeks. Compare that to what you see in Nicaea too. It's night and day. I mean, you have in the Greek talk about their thrones that all the bishops sit on. And then if you look at the Latin letter, it's his throne of the blessed prince of apostles, Peter, and the guy who sits on his throne. It's totally different meaning. And we actually have a whole, and this is on New Advent, so it's not like I'm pulling from, Orthodox sources, a whole letter that's in the Latin that was never even read in Nicaea II. And it's like bashing the Greeks over jurisdictional things, which were not conceded in Nicaea II, and maintained were still an issue in the 9th century afterwards. So we have to understand a lot of these differences are part of a fluid view of the authority of a letter. There's a sense a canonical letter, but also a certain degree of permissible fluidity given to the legates to try to get as much concessions as possible when they go there. It's diplomacy, quite frankly. So what's important? One, what's a ecumenical authority is what everyone accepted, okay, which mainly is usually the Greek letters, and the Latin letters that correspond with these. The second thing is the Latin letters aren't thereby unimportant. It does speak of the intent of the person writing it, especially when they're canonizing. So I think we really need this more holistic view, and we could have this view without discrediting the whole manuscript record, which I'm just, I guess, totally against historically.
Eric, how do Roman Catholics respond to their Eighth Ecumenical Council? This council that they accept as ecumenical was condemned by a later ecumenical council that declared invalid the one now declared by Roman Catholics as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. This council even condemns the Filioque edition. Pope John VIII accepted this council as ecumenical. This was from Torpedo Fish, a reference to Socrates.
Yeah, good question. So the Council of Constantinople 869 and the Council of Constantinople 879 both had no definitive doctrinal contributions. All historians recognize that. So they could be annulled, resurrected over and over again, according to Roman Catholic understanding. There are some ecumenical councils, one of the Lateran councils, for example. There are certain canons that were not followed from the early apostolic canons because of the canonical tradition that gave way in the second millennium in the Latin West. So, when you have a council, even if it's an ecumenical council in name, it could come up with all kinds of disciplinary rules on how the sacraments should be done, how penance should be done, how many days should be given as a punishment for adultery, et cetera, et cetera. And then later on, that council with all of its canons can be annulled to make room for a reform. And then the reform can be cut and put aside to resurrect the older practice. So that's how I would speak to, those two councils. But nothing in those councils poses a threat to Catholic teaching today. So, so that's what I would say. I mean, it's a good question, but I don't think it has the force that as if it's a challenge to Rome.
Okay. Another follow-up question from Dustin for Craig. Just like Christ had an immediate, clear self-understanding, so too did Peter. And just as it took time for the church to fully understand the mystery of papal supremacy, this theologically explains why historically it took time for particular churches to fully appreciate papal supremacy. People ignoring or protesting Rome doesn't invalidate her rightful authority any more than people rebelling against God invalidates his rightful authority. What exactly would you dispute with that?
It sounds like that saying that it sounds like a sea doctrine almost, that the papacy really just wasn't there, but enough was there for it to grow into what it was. If that's what he's saying, the answer is no, that's false. The apostles were led to all truth. That's the promise made by Jesus Christ. The faith that was once and all delivered to the saints, again, through the apostles. All we're doing now is updating terminology and responding to things that were never taught by Christians with what has been taught and making it clearer, because oftentimes what's false makes much clearer what you know to be true. This idea that, well, it took time for people to figure out who Jesus Christ was, so now it's going to take centuries. I mean, the window of that was closed with the giving the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. So if that's what he's saying, I'd have to disagree with him.
Well, I don't see any other questions. If I missed any, just put them in the comment section, and you know, our debaters here will read them hopefully when they get a chance, and you know, if time permits, they'll respond there. So if I miss anything, I apologize. Just put it in the comment section. But yeah, I think that is it. I'm really glad that y'all came on and did this. Sorry that we carried it a little longer than normal, but you know. This was definitely something we needed to address, so I'm glad that y'all both came on.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to be here. Mike, what do we have to look forward to this week on the channel?
Yeah, there's a couple, actually there's a show every day, but offhand I recall we have Dr. Jared Goff on Wednesday, Jay Dyer on Friday. We have a Canon roundtable on Thursday. With Turretin Fan, Albrecht, and both of you, and then trying to think Tuesday offhand. I don't recall tomorrow's.
So I think is it Timothy Flanders, right?
Yes, absolutely. Timothy Flanders will be discussing the crisis and different solutions to the crisis in the church, as well as redemptive suffering and things of that sort. So yes, I'm so sorry that evaded me for the moment, but yeah, we have quite a few things coming up, not only this week, but you know, in this month and the next month to come. So definitely take a look at the show calendar at reasonandtheology.com. Just click on show and you'll see, you know, all the guests and topics that we'll have discussed in the future. So everybody, thank you for watching. Please share, like, subscribe, get, you know, comments going in the comment section, and let's see if we can dive into this issue of who started the schism even deeper and continue the conversation there in the com box. So again, thank you all for watching. God bless, and I think that'll do it. Take care.